Look at the water from any coastline in the world. You can see maybe 3 miles before the horizon swallows everything. No land, no signal, no way of knowing what's out there, or if anything is out there at all. Now imagine standing on that same shore 60,000 years ago. No compass, no map, no written language, no boat technology we would recognize today. And somewhere across that invisible horizon sat an entire continent that no human had ever seen, touched, or knew existed. They crossed anyway. And we still don't fully understand how. This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about accident. It is the story of the single most extraordinary act of deliberate navigation in the entire history of our species. And the evidence for how they did it will permanently change how you think about what a human mind is actually capable of. Let's start with what the crossing actually was, because most people hear 60,000 years ago and picture something vague and distant. So, here are the facts, and they are not vague at all. 60,000 years ago, during a period of lower sea levels, the landmasses we now call Indonesia and Papua New Guinea were partially connected to the Asian continent. Researchers call this ancient landmass Sundaland. Australia, combined with New Guinea and Tasmania into a single larger continent called Sahul, sat separated from Sundaland across a stretch of open ocean. That gap, even at its narrowest point, was never less than 60 miles of deep, open water. There was no land bridge. There was no shallow wading crossing. There was only ocean in every direction, for distances no human voice could carry and no human eye could see across. And yet, by 65,000 years ago, at the latest, humans were on the other side. The evidence is unambiguous. At Majid Bebe Rock Shelter in Australia's Northern Territory, archaeologists have recovered stone tools, grinding stones, and ochre in layers dated by 3 independent methods to between 65,000 and 80,000 years ago. These weren't accidental objects. They were the organized material remains of a functioning human community. People were not just surviving in Australia 65,000 years ago. They were living there, which means the crossing happened before that, which means someone, somewhere, looked at 60 miles of open ocean and made a decision. Here is what that decision required, and this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being something else entirely. To cross open ocean deliberately, you do not need luck. You need information. Specifically, you need to know that something is out there worth crossing to. A coastline you cannot see, a land you have never visited, does not announce itself. So, how did they know? The answer is birds, specifically the behavior of birds at sea. Any experienced ocean observer notices the same thing. Land birds fly out from shore in the morning and return in the evening. The direction they return from tells you exactly where land is, even when that land is invisible below the horizon. Seabirds, the ones that nest on land but feed at sea, follow predictable daily patterns that a careful observer can read like a map. Your ancestors were careful observers. They had been reading animal behavior for survival for hundreds of thousands of years before this crossing. The birds were not decoration. They were navigation instruments. But knowing land exists is not the same as being able to reach it. And this is where the engineering begins. No physical remains of the boats used for this crossing have ever been found, and they never will be. Wood, bark, and fiber decompose completely over 60,000 years. But the crossing itself is the evidence. You cannot accidentally drift 60 miles of open ocean and arrive with enough people to found a viable breeding population. Population genetics tells us the founding group of Australia was large enough to sustain a genetically diverse society. Estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000 individuals. That is not one boat. That is a fleet. That is multiple crossings or one extraordinarily organized mass migration. Either way, it requires boats capable of carrying people, food, and fresh water across open ocean in conditions that could change without warning. Experimental archaeology has given us the best evidence for what those boats looked like. Bamboo, which grew abundantly across Sundaland, is one of the most naturally buoyant materials on Earth. A bamboo raft of sufficient size is stable enough to cross open water, carries significant load, and can be constructed with no metal tools whatsoever. Lashing materials from plant fibers, prepared the same way your ancestors prepared everything else, provide binding strong enough to survive ocean swells. Researchers have built experimental bamboo rafts using only tools and techniques available 60,000 years ago, and successfully crossed open water comparable to the Sahel crossing. The raft was not the hard part, the navigation was. Here is what open ocean navigation without instruments actually looks like, because it is not guesswork. It is a complete sensory system developed over generations of coastal observation. Wave patterns. In the open ocean, deep swells travel in consistent directions determined by prevailing winds and geography. An experienced navigator can feel the direction of primary swells through the hull of a vessel, even at night, even in choppy surface conditions. The swell does not care about clouds or darkness. It is always there, always directional, always readable to someone trained from childhood to feel it. Star paths. The night sky above the equatorial region where this crossing occurred is among the clearest on Earth. Specific stars rise and set at specific points on the horizon with extraordinary consistency. A navigator who has memorized those paths, which oral cultures transmitted across generations, with a precision that would impress a modern astronomer, can hold a bearing through an entire night crossing purely by starlight. Wind direction. The seasonal monsoon patterns of the region between Sundaland and Sahel follow consistent, predictable cycles. Crossings timed to the right season would have had reliable wind direction working in their favor, not against them. Smell. This sounds strange until you understand what a coastline actually smells like from miles offshore. Vegetation, soil, bird colonies, and fresh water all produce chemical signatures that travel downwind across water. An experienced ocean traveler can smell land before they can see it. Your ancestors did not stumble across Australia. They read the ocean the way you read a road, with a system of knowledge so refined by generations of observation that it functioned as reliably as any instrument we have built since. And when they arrived, what they found was a continent that had never experienced a human predator, animals that had no fear response to upright figures walking toward them, landscapes of extraordinary abundance, a continent that had been waiting, untouched, for the most adaptive species on Earth to find it. The oldest continuous culture on the planet began on that shore. The Aboriginal Australians, whose ancestors made that crossing 65,000 years ago, maintained an unbroken oral tradition across more generations than any other human culture on Earth. The Dreamtime stories, the songlines that map the entire Australian continent through narrative and music, represent the longest uninterrupted cultural transmission in human history. They are, in a very real sense, the living memory of what it felt like to arrive somewhere completely new and make it home. Here is what nobody tells you about this story. The crossing to Australia is not a footnote in human history. It is the proof of something that changes everything about how we understand our own species. Before 65,000 years ago, every human movement across the planet had followed land. Coastlines, river valleys, grassland corridors. The crossings were extensions of walking. Australia ended that. Australia required something categorically different. It required committing to a direction with no confirmation that you were right until you either arrived or died. It required trusting accumulated knowledge over immediate sensory experience. It required the ability to plan for an outcome you had never personally witnessed. Cognitive scientists have a name for this capacity. They call it mental time travel. The ability to project yourself into a future that does not yet exist, to act on a plan rather than a stimulus. It is considered one of the defining features of modern human cognition. And 65,000 years ago, a group of people on a beach in what is now Indonesia demonstrated it completely by getting into boats and pointing them at a horizon that gave them nothing back. Go back to that coastline, stand at the edge of the water, and look out at where the horizon cuts the sky. The ocean looks the same as it did 60,000 years ago. The horizon is in the same place. The birds are still flying the same patterns. The swells are still running in the same directions. The only thing that has changed is that you would take out your phone, open a map, and already know exactly what is on the other side. Your ancestors had none of that. They had observation, accumulated knowledge, the courage to act on it, and boats built from what the beach gave them. They crossed anyway. And every human being alive in Australia today, and every person anywhere on Earth who carries a trace of that ancient migration in their DNA, exists because someone 65,000 years ago looked at an impossible horizon and decided that was not a reason to stay. You did not inherit their tools. You inherited their certainty that the crossing was possible. You use it every single day. You just forgot where it came from.